It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to people from around the world on issues making headlines. Christmas is usually a time for families to gather, exchange gifts, have turkey and enjoy silly games and all the festivities that the season brings. We also take the time to think about our neighbours who aren't as fortunate and lend a helping hand. Now, South Korea is the only country in East Asia to recognise Christmas as a national holiday, but Christmas here may not be so familiar for those who are accustomed to Western traditions of spending the day with family. We talk about the differences today with Gil-soo, Associate Professor of Communications and Media Studies at Monash University in Melbourne, and Jakob Minell, a graduate student at Seoul University's Graduate School of International Studies in Seoul. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And well, let's start with you, Professor Han. Now, South Korea, it was a country that long held Confucian values and had a Buddhist culture, and Christianity actually took off relatively recently in modern history. So when did Christmas actually become introduced to the country, and how did the tradition really get started here?
Yeah, the first Christmas tree in Korea was prepared by a Christian missionary Mary Scranton, the founder of Ewha Girls' School in 1886. And the first Santa Claus was acted by another missionary, Henry Appenzeller, the founder of Bae College in 1887. On Christmas Day, he filled the socks with presents and gave them to the Bae students. And what better things can the young boys expect in those days? By 1898, Christmas was rapidly settling as a pretty well-known popular event in Korea. And importantly, it was during the 1920s and 1930s under Japanese imperialism that especially the affluent young Korean men and women under the long Confucian tradition of self-control or arranged marriage embraced free Western-style dating and love marriage. Because these are part of modernity, they aspired rather than being traditional and outdated lifestyles in their views. So there is a long tradition of why Christmas has settled a day for young lovers in Korea. And then moving forward, it was by the American military government in 1945 as they declared Christmas Day a national public holiday, and again by Christian President Arirang in 1949, and it goes.
Oh, but Professor Han, how did the tradition become so widely celebrated though?
Now, with the start of the American military government in 1945, one way to control the people was a curfew. No civilians were allowed to move outside the home after 12 midnight. Otherwise, you are in police custody till the morning. But there were two exceptional days, Christmas and New Year's Eve. You know, winter solstice or Dongji is the winter day with the longest night on which Koreans stay as late as possible. I remember my mother telling me, if I went to bed too early, my eyebrows will go completely gray in the morning. Now, Koreans could not keep both Dongji and Christmas, which fall onto the end of the year, with the introduction of the Western solar calendar. Then the Korean Dongji, based on the lunar calendar, was pushed out of the Korean culture. I think another significant reason Christmas became popularized was that the Western missionaries preparing beautiful Christmas trees and inviting children to the church not only offered them the gospel, but the Christmas gift box from America, containing stationeries, candies, and biggies. No children could resist such temptation. This tradition, in practice during Japanese imperialism, was then transferred to the hands of Korean churches, especially after the Korean War. Therefore, exchanging presents has become an important part of Christmas. That is, of course, commercialization.
I see. Well, now let's bring Jakob into the conversation. So in the Western culture, Christmas is usually a time for families to gather, share gifts, have really good food, turkey mostly, right? And overall just have a very merry time together. But here in Korea, it's quite different, isn't it? What's Christmas like back at home?
Yes, good morning. Surely it is very different. So I am half Swedish and half Norwegian. However, we celebrate Christmas kind of similar. Actually, we celebrate on the 24th, Christmas Eve. Christmas Day is not really important for us in that way. What we celebrate on the 24th, but basically the whole week before is building up to this event. So in my case, we usually go to the family cabin in the mountains, and we go skiing and sit in the sauna and play board games together with family members that you can basically only meet during this time of year. So Christmas Eve is kind of the crescendo, but this lazy couple of days before Christmas is what most people like the most. And then, of course, on Christmas Eve, we have rice porridge in the morning. We watch Christmas TV shows. We have some Christmas food. And then, of course, Santa comes with the presents. So Christmas Day for us is more like, I would probably call it like a food hangover, where we regret eating those last spoonfuls of meatballs or sausages the day before.
Well, I think that regret might be universal no matter where you go, right? But, well, how was your first Christmas here in South Korea?
Well, actually, the first time I spent Christmas in South Korea was the first time that I spent Christmas outside of Sweden and Norway. So it was back in 2016, and I still, for some way, wanted to keep this kind of Christmas feeling. So I went to one of these online traveling communities and found some other Swedish people who were currently in Seoul. However, it ended up with us having Korean barbecue, and later on went to a bar. So it was very, very different from the traditional Christmas that you would have at home. And that's when I also realized that clearly that this is not a family thing in Korea. This is for friends and for couples.
But barbecue, yes, very important. Good food is a very essential part of Christmas Day. And Professor Han, now here in South Korea, you did mention this earlier in your response, but Christmas is it's actually settled as kind of a second Valentine's Day. All the restaurants, the eateries, the hotels, they're full to the brim, and it's mostly only couples that exchange gifts. How did it become so focused on romance?
Yeah. Christmas has become a day of celebration for lovers in Korea. I think important dimension of Korean Christmas is that Koreans leave home for activities outside the home, especially young people. I think this tradition of focusing on romance has much to do with the pathways that Korean society has gone through so rapidly, politically, culturally, and economically. South Koreans have admired the West, especially the American culture. And the young people in Korea lived under strict control by autocratic regimes for decades. For many young people, White Christmas Day is a dream come true day with absolute freedom and no control. It is a day for a party, entertainment, and people make an effort to create memorable moments. It is an eruption of young people's frustration and passion. And of course, profiteering continues to fuel this culture. Unfortunately, these days, an increasing number of young people are deprived of resources and unable to be part of these popular cultures. And this creates a severe degree of dissatisfaction, which develops as a form of discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. Of course, here, the core message of Christmas is badly missing under extreme commercialization and entertainment.
And Jacob, well, I wonder what you actually make of this commercialization and this very couple-oriented culture of Christmas in Korea.
Well, first of all, I believe that it's not only Korea, it's Christmas in any country in the world now has become very commercialized, and it's not only Christmas. Most major holidays have gone from probably their traditional core value to a more commercialized one. As a non-Korean, of course, it creates a bit of maybe a bit of a shock in the beginning. As I mentioned before, I really realized that it's very different than what people do back home. But then again, Korea already has two major family holidays with Chuseok and Seollal, where they can meet together. So I guess for the Koreans, maybe I don't really see the harm that this can be a day for when couples meet.
So, well, South Korea does indeed have two traditional holidays, the Lunar New Year and Chuseok, our version of Thanksgiving here in the country, when families do have big gatherings. But then you might say that it has quite a lot of these, well, Christmassy events, actually monthly events even. Professor Han, South Korea has a lot of days to celebrate each month, such as Pepero Day, White Day, Black Day. The list really goes on all throughout the year, really. And why are there so many commercialized days? And do you think this is good for society?
No, it's not good for the society at all. But it's an important question for all of us, I think. Creating those commercialized days is not unique to Korea. And people are always in the business of attaching some meaning to their activities. And taking the example of Pepero Day, say you grab 4 sticks of Pepero and it looks like November 11th. What has this got to do with the friends or lovers sharing these chocolate sticks? Yeah, there is nothing wrong with having some fun out of these between the friends. And I am sure Pepero company makes a good profit out of this. I think these things can go out of hand as to what is really important in our community. If you allow, I would add that talking about the spirit of Christmas, it is the baby Jesus incarnation to forgive and be friendly to the sinful world. Then we ask now, how do we share Jesus' teaching with the orphans and widows today? Or it could be about Korean political leaders creating a community more caring of each other, all Koreans prospering together, reducing the proportion of the disadvantaged population, creating more life opportunities for young people in particular. I think these are some urgent and big questions, but achievable, as there are examples like Sweden and other European countries. I know Korea has enough talents with strategies and resources. The question is whether they have the will to do that.
Well, Professor Han, one might argue that South Koreans already have two big holidays, Lunar New Year and Chuseok, Thanksgiving, to gather with their families. But in recent years, we've seen a decline in people going home, back to their hometowns to spend time with their family on Seollal and Chuseok. And they're actually spending more time alone, going on staycations or going abroad. What's the reason for this shift in trend, and do you think it's going to continue?
Yeah, I think a very popular notion in Korea is that the Chuseok and Seollal are about family gatherings, and the Christmas is for the lovers to spend time together outside the home. In this respect, Christmas has got very little to do with Christianity. It is about freeing themselves away from long working hours in an affluent Korea because they can afford it. Perhaps the cost of going for 1 week holiday in Southeast Asia is comparable to the cost of traveling in Korea for a week. I remember Japanese tourists in the 1980s with so much value of Japanese yen doing what Koreans are doing now. I think the critical juncture that has brought about this culture of staycations and going abroad is the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Prior to that time, Koreans were willing to sacrifice their personal needs for the sake of national development, and the spirit of can-do was really prevalent. However, in affluent Korea, Koreans ask, what is there for me? And what can my nation and company do for me? At the same time, interestingly, they continue to care for the wealth of the nation for their own sake. This is what I may call calculated nationalism. I think there are lots of positives here, and it's not all that bad, and the trend will continue, I think.
See, well, before we go, Jacob, for those who are away from their families here in South Korea this Christmas, are there any little-known advantages of spending it here in the country? And do you have any recommendations on how they can feel the festivity and really make the most of this Christmas?
Well, absolutely. I was talking before about the family holiday back home in Sweden, but the downside of that is, of course, that people who don't have a family to spend it with are bound to feel very lonely. So in Korea, there's always something that you can do on Christmas, even though you're not spending it with your family. For the recommendation, I would first begin to say that it's not going to be like home, and the sooner you realize that, the better. But there are still plenty of things that you can do here. You can go outside in nature. While social distancing, you can try to go hiking. You can invite friends over for dinner. But I also feel that one important thing this Christmas is that we should probably send a thought to those families around the world that right now have members in the ICU. And of course, this Christmas is not ideal. It's not what any of us wanted, but it is what we have right now. And as the professor was talking about before, the core value of Christmas, I think it's more important now than ever that we really embrace this core value and think about each other and take care of each other. So hopefully then we can celebrate a normal Christmas next year.
I see. Well, this is where we're going to have to wrap up this interview. That was Gil-soo, Associate Professor of Communications and Media Studies at Monash University, and Jakob Minell, Graduate School student at Sogang University in Seoul. Thank you both so much for your time, and have a lovely Christmas.
Thank you. Merry
Thanks
Christmas.
for having me.